I think I would lean to the extent that there's a controversy between whether biomimetic design is is a promising path forward. I would side with I would side with those that that think it's good to take inspiration from nature, but really have to stop short there, and really have to involve the rest of non-natural sciences to carry it from there. I think that being too cavalier on biomimicry, like drawing from nature, can sometimes miss the point. I think a great example is the carbon fixing materials, like looking at a tree. The tree can fix carbon, but adopting all the components the tree has sort of misses the mark. The tree is an organism expressing genes in an environment. It has lots of other concerns. It needs to survive certain weather events, but it also has to reproduce. It fundamentally is focused on reproduction and survival. It looks like recently the field with like xenorobotics and so forth, they're going more the other direction. They're taking nature and mutating it towards the non-natural. But in terms of like having completely synthetic things self-replicate, we haven't made a lot of progress there. But I would also say that is a characterization problem.
In this podcast, I'm sharing my passion and curiosity for soft robotics, where we share inspiring stories about the work we do and how we can push the limit. I am Mara Dwayne, and this is Soft Robotics Podcast. Support for this show comes from Science Robotics Journal. I really find Science Robotics to be a great resource for reliable and tangible research where we can really push the limit of the science we do in robotics. Great way to stay up to date with the published article is checking out the released monthly issue. All the links will be included in each episode description. We will also happen to have a regular conversation on the most published science robotic articles, where also you can contribute with your question and thoughts about the research. Thanks Science Robotics for sponsoring Soft Robotics Podcast.
So maybe if you can briefly, how you'd like to define yourself for people maybe first time listening to you, how would you like to define yourself?
Well, my official title here, I'm the Carbon P. Dubs Professor of Chemical Engineering here at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I run a research group focused on nanotechnology. I'm a chemical engineer by training. I run a research group of about 20 students and postdocs where we combine chemical engineering and nanotechnology to solve a wide range of problems in medicine, energy, material science, and that's why I'm here today.
Mm-hmm, great. So maybe I'll ask you first, and you focus about how we can come up, for example, new material, one of aspect of research, and using chemistry and mathematics. I wanted to go before that to the plant because also something very interesting you have been working on. What do you think about the design of material still missing in the material design?
So I can go to this most recent advance to illustrate it. Scientists have been thinking about whether we could form a polymer, polymerize in 2 dimensions, for several decades. I think the earliest reference we find is in the 1940s. And a polymer, as your audience might know, is normally a snake-like molecule. We call it one-dimensional because its molecules hooked one after the other to make a chain. So that's a polymer, and they form in some way the plastics that we see all around us, the plastic case on our phone, the plastic casings in the plastic fibers in our clothing. So polymerizing in 2 dimensions makes a completely new material with different mechanical properties. It's a whole new area of material science. Scientists have wanted to do it for several decades. The thing that our paper shows is that it's a nanotechnology problem in that we did not have the traditional tools of polymer science are not available to completely understand if you've made the material or not. So we ended up having to do things like imaging and atomic force microscopy. A lot of the tools that we use routinely in nanotechnology to figure out whether you've made a two-dimensional material. The standard in the field is can you show that the material is just a molecular layer thick? That's the key signature that you've made a 2D material. If I go back in time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we didn't have tools that could answer that question. So I mean, someone could have invented this new class of material by accident. They wouldn't have a way to prove it. And so that's something notable. That in material science, at least in this two-dimensional polymer space, we have a blind spot in that we need to tap new techniques in order to verify that we've made the material.
Maybe I want to ask you also that in kind of inventing new materials, when you look into the future, for example, Atlantic and self-repair itself, being in harsh environments, it's all featured together. If you can give us a story behind how, for example, can we come up with feature exactly what we see for a planet, or example, the design process?
Well, because we've also been working on what are called carbon fixing materials. So this is an idea I've introduced several years ago. It's a hard process to realize, but for carbon fixing materials, it was different. People had not been thinking about that. The inspiration really comes from nature. If you look at a tree, the tree is repairing itself. It's adding more material. It adds material from the atmosphere, namely carbon. And carbon is unique in that it's available. It's not in high concentration, but it's all over the Earth. Everywhere on Earth, you have access to carbon as a building material. So if you can make a material that can fix carbon, in other words, pull carbon in from the atmosphere and attach it, to its backbone, you can make something last forever. That material would then have the chemistry to repair itself, and have a longevity that far exceeds what other materials have. And that's what we see in nature. We see materials that are on their face, they're very fragile, right? So how do they survive? Well, they're able to do this carbon fixation. They're able to constantly take in carbon from the atmosphere and in some form, right? And attach it to them or build themselves out of it. And that is, we can ask the question: Can we make synthetic materials? Can we make materials for humans that do the same thing? Most of what's around you right now, if you look around, from your clothing to carpets, even in the walls, all of that is made of carbon. It's in some way, and so this connecting the ubiquitousness of carbon in the atmosphere to materials, I think it's a long time coming. Yeah, that's a roundabout way of saying we were inspired by nature. Now that said, it's a very hard scientific problem to say, can I make this block of material absorb carbon dioxide, input energy because you have to, and then chemically make the materials that represent its building block. We've made some prototypes. We've learned a lot. We've made some big advances, but there's more basic scientific research needed in order to get that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's interesting when you say the material could be lost if there's damage, for example. They can have higher toughness. That what you imply for, that's gold, right?
Yeah. So people have made, so there is a field of self-healing materials. People have made polymers that are self-healing. There's lots of ideas. A lot of the polymer self-healing ideas, though, are limited by mass in the following way. Like one idea, it's pretty innovative and it does work. Is you take a material and you put little capsules of monomer inside. Like monomer is the chemical that makes up a polymer. And then if the material forms a crack, you could have it so that the monomer will bleed into the crack. you put some catalyst there, and it'll polymerize. And those techniques work. My colleagues have done that, and it's very impressive. But it's a limitation in that the material itself can't gain any more mass than what you start with. And the second limitation is you have to start off by taking a good material and punching holes in it. So conceptually, it's good, but it has that limitation in that the amount of mass that you have to start with is fixed. A tree does not have that limitation. A tree can access an infinite reservoir of carbon, and that really enables the tree. That enables it can grow, it can add to its mass, it can repair defects, but it can tap this infinite reservoir of atmospheric carbon. So that's what distinguishes carbon fixing materials. And it is sort of a dividing line. The self-healing materials field, they've advanced from little capsules to like putting vasculature in. You could put like little veins through the material, and that does help. I mean, you can pump more and more material in, but still fundamentally, you're not able to tap this infinite reservoir. Just to highlight for your listeners the scope of this problem, you need a catalyst that can take in energy like from the sun, and then it has to be able to reduce the carbon dioxide, which is also a challenge in and of itself, to a chemical that can then be transformed into a monomer that can then build onto a material. And you have to do this within the material itself. So it's a chemistry, energy, nanotechnology problem. It's a very hard problem.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Maybe I want to ask you, in the space of the choices for this feature, you mentioned self-healing and also, for example, how we can design long-lasting material. Maybe I want to ask you your view about the choices of the solution or the way to go for approaching new solution or new design. What's your view on that?
Well, so biomimicry is a great starting point. There's lots of debates in the literature to the extent that we can borrow from nature. I think we can be inspired from nature. In this particular area of carbon fixing materials, the more you want to borrow from nature, the easier the problem gets. So our first prototype material, we were literally harvesting parts from plant cells, and if you put that in, and you can make a very impressive gel, and it grows. But we don't build the world out of biological things exclusively. Sometimes we need things that are that have different combinations of properties. Think about airplane wings. Think about the sides of buildings in your home. So there we have to combine. We to some extent, to solve these problems, we have to move beyond what nature can provide.
Mm. Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah.
Maybe I want to ask you again about the design and coming up with new material. Which one is significant to you? Is the material side development that's part, or the other part is the architecture or the morphology and how the shape can really change the game, how the material would behave? Which one is significant to you?
Oh, the underlying molecular structure of a material plays an enormous role in the properties that you realize. Yeah, if I were to say, you're talking sort of philosophy across all materials, but no, that's the impetus for asking questions in the first place, like, can I polymerize in two dimensions? Why do I have to polymerize just in one dimension? And that's our recent advance. Just for your podcast listeners, my group, we invented a two-dimensional polyaramid, which is sort of like a Kevlar, but we were the first to be able to polymerize it into two dimensions. So yeah, the underlying molecular structure, if you can access new molecular structures, you can make new materials for sure. Whether you can design that, I know you've asked a few times about design. It's tricky. Yeah. I don't know if it's a universal. Even in this case, we did not design. What we really did was discover a new mechanism for how materials synthesize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something maybe still challenging for you when it comes to developing new material. What are maybe the key challenges so far, maybe in your group or maybe generally speaking, when it comes to new material? Maybe, for example, having capability to repair itself or whatever feature you're looking for. It is something key challenge here. Still very hard to solve.
Hands down, it's characterization. We as material scientist, chemist, chemical engineer, we have not reached the limits of what we can do to characterize the unique materials that we can make, especially at multiple length scales. And I say that, and I'm sort of spoiled because never before in history have I had access to very powerful tools. Like I can send my students into the lab with collaborators, but I mean, I can image individual molecules. I can even image atoms in a solid material. But I can't do that easily. That's the thing. We have these powerful tools, transmission electron microscopy. It can give us atomic resolution. It doesn't mean that I can understand everything that's in my sample. It takes one of the things that people don't realize in the field, or is underappreciated in the field, is that when you image at the atomic scale, you're seeing such a very, very tiny part of the material. You're also pre-selecting for the parts of the material that can be prepared easily for that kind of imaging. So I would think the main limitation today is characterization. We need more powerful tools. I think in the future I can envision someone will solve the problem of high throughput chemical imaging. It'd be wonderful to have a technique that you could image the underlying chemistry at the atomic level, but in a high throughput way, in a way that's very robust, where you can see it over different length scales. That's an opportunity. There's still a lot to discover in that space as well. In hierarchical materials that form. Generally, if a material forms a very well-defined crystal, it's easy to understand it. We have a lot of tools designed for crystals. So if something's forming a perfect crystal, you can understand a lot about its structure and then its chemistry. If it doesn't, though, it's much harder. It's harder to describe, and like I said, especially if it shows anisotropy, and yeah. So I'll leave it at that.
And I agree with you, it's very hard to understand what's happening in molecular scale. For you, how to connect the dots to get a meaningful explanation in this scale? And what's differentiated from continuum scale, for example, to have a picture of understanding here?
Well, scientists better than I have introduced a wide variety of new tools. We have the ability to do what's called multi-scale modeling now. So there are researchers that can simulate materials at different scales and link them together. That turns out to be a very powerful tool. Even in this recent study that we did, I was fortunate to be able to collaborate with my colleague Heather Kulik, and her group does density functional theory. They're able to, those tools have just become absolutely essential now. So if you have a hypothesis of what a material might look like or what its structure should be, we're very lucky now. We can go to a computer, we can ask it to solve Schrodinger's equation, and we can mainly falsify hypotheses. We can rule out structures, and there are things that we can learn. So this multi-scale problem is difficult, but we have tools to tackle it today that we've never had before.
Mm-hmm. And what makes sure that the design is really reliable? For example, sensor design or sensor material or material work as actuator and sensor at the same time, or higher toughness. How we make sure this reliable design in the end?
Yeah, reliable design. It's interesting. You can try to build in a design for reliability. Let me try to think about that, because reliability I often think of as reproducibility of techniques and things like that. That's very much that can be as much process oriented as built into a molecular design. When a design leads to variability, we think of something as unstable. So that's and I guess you could design a material to be stable. So maybe that's the answer you're looking for, is that there are lots of materials we can make, but if they're fragile or unstable, then there's something about the design that's not reliable. Is that it? Does that make sense?
That I agree with you, yeah. And maybe I want to ask you, when it comes to maybe the other question, do you think still challenging to be answered in that space? What are the challenging questions, do you think?
Well, so it's interesting. If you're synthesizing different materials, materials that are unstable or metastable become very hard to characterize. So if they're a pathway towards a big discovery, then that sort of becomes hidden. So if you need to make a precursor and it's not stable, it doesn't live long enough, then it becomes a challenge even to verify that you've made it. And that does come up in material science. It's come up in my own work sometimes. Yeah, so let's think about that. What are the blind spots in material design? I think what you're getting at is that metastable materials can sometimes blind us from a promising synthetic pathway. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, but ultimately, I'm going to come back to characterization. I think the more we can measure and understand in materials science, I think we're going to discover more. And I think my recent work is probably just a very small another indicator in that column. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, this part. Maybe I want to ask you, when it comes to characterization and understanding what's happening, if there's something was counterintuitive or surprising while doing this process of characterization to explain something, was counterintuitive or surprising?
Well, yeah, in terms of something that is that's counterintuitive. Yeah, let me think. Like, let's see, a counterintuitive aspect that is that comes up in the material science space.
Yes, so like for behavior or in the characterization.
I have an example.
Interesting.
I have an example. In one area of my lab, we make nanopores. We make very small pores. We use molecules that are called carbon nanotubes, and they're hollow. And so, I mean, researchers have wanted to do stuff inside the pore for quite a while. For one kind of experiment, I want to seal that pore between two chambers. You know, think about, like, I want to put a chemical on one side and something else on the other side, and I want to be able to look at flow. It turns out something that's counterintuitive is that a thick piece of plastic or even silicon dioxide, it's almost impossible to seal to form a micron size or nanometer size seal with these materials that you think should, like things like plastic that make up your plastic bag. You will always find you'll find that they leak. They leak at the nanometer scale. But nature has found a very thin and seemingly fragile way to seal materials, and it's with the lipid bilayer membrane. If I replace that piece of plastic with just a soap bubble, like just a lipid layer that's a part of every cell, boy, like you can get a gigaohm electric field seal with this like nanometer, and it seems so that is often counterintuitive that a material that's 100, even 1,000 times thicker that humans might slab down there is still leaky and porous, whereas the simple lipid bilayer membrane just makes a perfect ohmic seal. And so that can be counterintuitive, because if your goal is to make a material and you want to seal something, you're thinking things that are thicker, maybe higher density, but you sort of miss this idea that this fragile thing that self-heals and involves lipids sort of moving and swimming in two dimensions. It somehow does such a great job of preventing an electric field from going through. So that's one counterintuitive example. I don't know if I have others. I'm trying to, yeah. I will say in the two-dimensional polymerization space, that was thought to be impossible, but which is why we're excited about the development. We asked a number of organic chemists, actually our collaborators who were on the paper, they did some computational studies, saying like if a molecule could look like this in 2D, it would have some advantageous properties. And those studies were published, and actually one of the criticisms that reviewers had on those papers were like, well, there's no evidence that these materials can even be made. And actually, when our collaborators went to chemists to say, could you make this material, organic chemists said, no, you can't make that material. And they were correct. Like there aren't existing methods and mechanisms in order to make it. So yeah, so this recent advance has been in making this two-dimensional polymer involves a completely new mechanism. So you could call that as counterintuitive.
Great. We want to ask you if there's something you disagree so far when it comes to the space of material design and coming up with new material. From your perspective, you disagree with.
Well, I think I would lean to the extent that there's a controversy between whether biomimetic design is a promising path forward. I would side with those that that think it's good to take inspiration from nature, but really have to stop short there, and really have to involve the rest of non-natural sciences to carry it from there. I think that being too cavalier on biomimicry, like drawing from nature, can sometimes miss the point. I think a great example is the carbon fixing materials, like looking at a tree. The tree can fix carbon, but adopting all the components the tree has sort of misses the mark. The tree is an organism expressing genes in an environment. It has lots of other concerns. It needs to survive certain weather events, but it also has to reproduce. It fundamentally is focused on reproduction and survival in ways that we don't necessarily want an airplane wing. And so I think we can borrow inspiration, maybe learn from the catalysis that's happening inside the natural system. I think we have to stop there, though. Yeah, and I think scientists will come down on different ends of the spectrum there. I think if you look at the developments in synthetic biology, colleagues there may differ with me. They may say no. The power of biological techniques, I think ultimately you could envision a world that's all derived from, say, a synthetic biology. Yeah, I would err on the other side. I would err on the side of getting inspiration, but not generating all of the solutions through biology.
Great. Since you considered a few questions, maybe I want to ask you when it comes to wish list in the design of the material. For example, as a robotics community, we speak about how we can design actuation and sensing in a reliable way and have enough forces and a high response time. For you, when you think about the wish list and the design of the new material, coming up with new material, how do you see the wish list? Is it something maybe trade-off that you can't really close so far just to come up with all the wish list features in one material? Is this something still conflicting or still hard to come up over this trade-off?
Yes, I think there it can. I think there are fundamental limitations into the kinds of functions you can combine in a material. I think that ultimately you have to start at the molecular level. In the past 10 to 20, maybe 30 years, material science, we have been inventing completely new materials that we haven't inspected in science before. I think that is promising. It moves us in the right direction. So a lot of nanomaterials like graphene, carbon nanotubes, but also material architectures like superlattices. I think that they open up the parameter space, but ultimately it's an empirical one. I think there's a role for discovery, maybe combinatorial discovery, but ultimately I think it starts at the molecular level that ultimately limits the number of properties that you can combine. Sometimes in the literature, you can see people losing sight of the fundamental trade-offs you have to make in order for a material to have these combination of properties. So for example, to go back to an example I used before, the concept of self-healing, but starting from punching holes inside the material and putting capsules in. So there's a fundamental trade-off there. There's a conservation rule, and that's the amount of mass you have to work with doesn't seem to change, right? And that forms a limitation. Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. Maybe I want to ask you if there's any still material in nature you have absorbed and still hard to maybe redesign in the lab. Material in nature was very maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of progress on materials that can replicate. We're seeing a little bit of it. You're seeing systems that can. We see. It looks like recently the field with like xenorobotics and so forth. They're going more the other direction. They're taking nature and mutating it towards the non-natural. But in terms of like having completely synthetic things, self-replicate. We haven't made a lot of progress there. But I would also say that is a characterization problem. That fundamentally, what it's going to take to do that, we don't have the tools to characterize the fundamentals of materials that could do that. And I say that I'll give a concrete example for your listeners. Right now in nanotechnology, perhaps the most impressive construction we can realize in nanotechnology uses DNA. DNA and its specificity, you can get what's called regioselective assembly with DNA. And there's an area called DNA nanotechnology. People have made these DNA bricks. You can do amazing things. It's no accident that it's DNA that's giving us that ability. But it would not have happened if DNA weren't so important for life. It would not be studied to the extent with the tools that it has and the ability to synthesize it to where we can then do DNA nanotechnology. It just so happens to be it's the one material that we can create, DNA in general, where we specify it at the sequence level. And I want you to think about like could we have synthetic polymers one day that are dialed in at the sequence level, and again, you could do that today, but how would you measure it? We don't have tools to measure it. So if you want to think about the future, you might think about DNA nanotechnology, but extended to everything, to just any arbitrary organic molecule that's concatenated together. Could it have a sequence selectivity the way we do with DNA? And when you do that, you'll make all kinds of very interesting structures. You'll make things that have like lock and key and look like enzymes, but they're made of like urethanes and polyimides and and other things, maybe inorganic materials as well. So hopefully that answers your question. I think the emerging theme is it does come down to tools that you can use to characterize and measure.
Mm-hmm. Great. Maybe it's a question list. I wanted to touch again, and I think in the beginning you mentioned longevity in the material. And I want to ask you, when we design long-lasting material, maybe never damaged, I don't know, do you believe that we can design material never damaged? What be consequences maybe from, as a human and also coming up with commercial product? Do you think it makes sense here in longevity in that case?
I think with carbon fixing, you could make materials that last dramatically longer. That is almost a fact. The proof that I have of that is mainly mechanistic. If you look at trees and biological systems, they live in terms of functional lifetimes. They live a lot longer than the lifetime of the constituent materials that they're made of. And the way they do that is with carbon fixation. Could you have a material that lasts an infinite amount of time? The second law of thermodynamics says that that's impossible. But it is a realizable goal to have a material that can have a dramatically extended engineering lifetime. And you can do that through these tricks like carbon fixation. Yeah, it's not a conceptual challenge; it's an engineering challenge. It's the question is how do you realize it? Yeah, I obviously think that, or I would not be working in that space. I obviously think we can get there. Yeah, but it's outside of just the conceptual idea space. It's an engineering challenge. How do you get materials that last an exceedingly long space? And I'll say too, just the motivation for that could never be more important. I would like your listeners to know that we use an enormous amount of polymer in our society, worldwide, nationwide. Almost all of it goes to landfill. Still, the amount of material, the tonnage, it's tens of millions of tons per year, just go right down into the hole, into landfill. Nobody wants that. It's a complete loss. Not only is material going into landfill, all of the energy that went into making the material is just getting dumped back into the earth. It's a losing proposition for humanity in general. So this idea of can we make materials that last dramatically longer, that are more valuable, and so they won't go to landfill is an important one. Like polymers give us a lot of advantages. They're very light. They're durable enough and light. We save a lot of energy in moving and packaging materials in polymer. But their lack of durability means they have this disposable nature. And their lack of durability means that they fundamentally are not valuable enough to keep them economically, it seems, from just being dumped into the ground. So I think making those polymers more valuable, making it so that if they can self-heal, they don't even need to be recycled. They're healing themselves. They're sort of recycling themselves. And we need a dramatic rethinking of that.
Mm-hmm. If there is any other maybe aspect, do you think maybe still not focused on the community when it comes to material design, maybe neglected or need more attention when it comes to the design?
I would like to get people to think about materials as not static entities. We sort of think of materials, we design them, we program them with properties, and then we sort of leave them out. And maybe a good way to think about it, this does go back to maybe biomimicry. Can we think of materials as, and I don't want to be too philosophical here, but can we think of materials as like living, breathing things that will continue to be active during their lifetime? And that is a fundamental reconception of what we think of as a material. If we're talking about natural systems, it's very common. But for a synthetic material, a block of metal or a block of polymer, we don't think in that way. Nanotechnology, to some extent, has given us new tools and new abilities to think that way. So the idea that you could take a block of something and sort of embed at almost zero mass little things inside of it that give it new properties. That's a nanotechnology idea, and it's been realized. Like I can take a polymer that is electrically insulating, I can sprinkle in some conducting nanoparticles, and I can make it a conducting polymer. And so this idea, I think nanotechnology can help us to expand our vision of what a material is, like what it can be.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Maybe I want to ask you, what makes you maybe fulfilled and satisfied when it comes to what you're doing? And if there is advice, maybe stick to your mind and was maybe a life-changing advice.
Advice. When I was a student, when I was a student, I did an internship at Brookhaven National Labs, and some advice I got there from the scientists there were to focus my career at the intersection between disciplines, that like where these two disciplines intersect. I mean, now it's very common. I've heard that advice now routinely. But I want to emphasize it as well. When two fields come together, there's a lot of new discovery that can happen. So that would be my advice in general, to the listener.